Good afternoon, everyone. So we can get this part out the way. I'm Miles, one of the general partners at Thrive. We're a small 8-person investment team investing from inception all the way to IPO. And we're fortunate to be partners with Jack and Lattice, as well as companies like Stripe, OpenAI, Ramp, Benchling, who you'll hear next, and a number of others. Jack and I actually started working together right as you finished up YC, and it was about 3 people. And I thought today we'd walk through, and I'd ask Jack some questions on Lattice's journey from being very much an initial wedge and, in some sense, a single feature product into a whole suite for HR, and the journey the company's gone on to achieve that, in a way to help shed light on that for any of you in the audience building companies where you've just got your first wedge, and probably with AI you're starting to get some success, and how Lattice maintained product velocity and took that single initial capability into a broader platform, and now a company with north of 100 million of revenue. And so, Jack, maybe we could start off, you could give a little framing on Lattice, and then we'll dive into the very early days in the first product.
Yeah, so where it is today is basically a bundle of tools that HR teams can use to do people management. And the thing about it that's different than like the last generation is basically centered around who's the true end customer. And what I would argue is that in the past, the HR team was really the end customer of these products. And with Lattice and the current generation of tools, in a way that I think is really good for the world and specifically for companies, though, the employee is sort of at the center. And so when we thought about doing performance management, for example, it was what does it take to make this something that makes an employee's life better? How does it make it something that is focused on their growth, something where they don't feel a lot of pain from it, but it's actually like a valuable career moment for them. Similarly, with like our engagement survey product, it was a way to make sure you're listening to employee feedback, that you're calibrated on that like on a quarterly basis, et cetera. And so that's basically the orientation around the whole company. And over time, it's been about 9 years now since founding, and basically over time what we've done is added more and more products for the same buyer to basically broaden out that suite of tools. So that's kind of like the 2 seconds.
Awesome. And so let's wind back the clock to the very early days. Early on, you just started with OKR tools. And many companies, there's all these stories out there of like, just keep going with the thing you've got. Persistence will pay off. Airbnb, for an example of like, seemed like a small idea, but keep going. You evolved pretty quickly before it was even 3 or 4 people to having the main first product, which was performance management. How did you decide to go from the first product to the second in those very early days, and not just keep hitting the one thing with a hammer?
Yeah, so we made like a big mistake in the first year of the company, which was the product that we started with was the wrong product, and we stuck with it for a long time. So it was this OKR tool. The idea was to basically set, track, and manage employee goals in this product. And our thought was that by having this in a dedicated software system, different than in like an Excel sheet, which is where people would typically have it, you would be able to have all these advantages where you could coordinate the goals between people. You'd be able to sort of like manage it at a high level. Employees would be able to see updates. You maybe could do integrations with other systems. That was the pitch. And we unfortunately got trapped in that sort of buyer dynamic for like 10 months. The trick that we experienced with it, the thing I think that was really hard, was that we had a lot of customers verbally telling us, and to some extent showing us, a lot of interest. We would go to the CEO of a 100-person company and say, "Are OKRs hard for you?" Yes, of course. Do you want, would it be helpful to have something that manage it? Yes, please, we'll try whatever. Do you want to pay for this thing? Well, let's try it. Let's see what happens. And, let's get in there. And we'll be like, okay, let's, we'll try a free rollout and we'll get there. And so the situation we found ourselves in during, YC, which was sort of, I guess, early winter 16, even by the time we started partnering with Miles, though, and we did our seed, we were in a dynamic where a lot of customers said they wanted the thing. They would even try the product with us, but it became extremely obvious to us after just a few months of using it that there was like very little retention to it. A company would run its quarterly goals process, and then a quarter later, they would kind of do it half-heartedly, and 2 quarters later, they would do it 20% heartedly. And we at some point looked at this and we said it's going to be both with how hard it is to get people to pay us up front, and then clearly what's happening on the retention side, there's just not going to be enough of it there. So that was, I think, one of the most important learnings for me at the beginning was there's when something really works, that's awesome. When a product doesn't work at all, you kind of know, like, okay, we're getting nothing. Most ideas are reasonable, and so it's actually really easy to get trapped in that reasonable middle where there's a little bit of pull, but you can slog along for years and years there without there being a big enough business. And my advice to founders now, upon reflection, and after once we found it, is basically to always to try. You're starting with the hypothesis that this is not an important enough product to warrant a big business, and I'm gonna, until somebody disproves that, that's my starting hypothesis, and then be really willing to not make like 10% iterations, but like 100% iterations on what you're doing.
Yeah, I think interesting there was you'd be able to get in the room, maybe you'd actually have the adoption, but being really honest about the retention of the product in terms of filling something longer term than just a point in time. And you'd moved from OKRs to performance management, but then also launched engagement surveys to round out the sort of 3 first pillars of the suite. We had some competitors at the time who were much bigger than Lattice at that moment, and no one else had done those 2 together.
Yeah.
And so it was also an interesting, controversial move to move to 3 product lines that early, especially when competitors certainly didn't have 2 of them together. Maybe walk through a bit of like that decision. Obviously, you took 7 engineers of 8 engineers and put them on that second product line at only a few million of ARR, which was you might call it a bet the company move at that point in time. But maybe walk through a bit of how you found that next product idea and made that call.
Yeah, I'll make 2 comments on competition. One when we were just in performance, and the other one we did engagement. And I think like this was true then. I think it's like triple true now, that like any category that sounds reasonable to you at this point in the life cycle of where technology is, if it sounds like a decent idea, there's like 9 companies working on it. And so competition is like a fact of life at this point in like the S-curve of startups. And that's totally fine. When we first built performance management, which was like the first product that worked, we had all these competitors who were like super well funded, like not like a little funded. We had like Reflective and BetterWorks and the companies with like $100 million of funding kind of thing, who were at
tens of millions of revenue.
Yes, exactly. They were at 5, 10, 20 of ARR when we're sitting at 500 or less. And one of my big learnings there is when you're very early and your company is small and you see something that is you see a company that's relatively larger than you with 20 million of ARR as a competitor sounds unimaginably big when you're getting started. And then in the fullness of time, if that's truly unimaginably big for your market, like it's not a good market anyway. And so I think that in the early days, like these battles are fought not over months or quarters, they play out over years, and a strong product orientation and dedication can get you on the map even in a competitive market. So that was like my first learning. And then the second, with the second product, that was a more nuanced learning where basically we had gotten to decent pole position in performance management. We were not yet the leader, but like we were like decidedly on the map. And then there was this other category of engagement surveys. And we knew what we were going to build was not as good as like what the standalone competition was. There were like, in engagement surveys, again, there were like these super well-funded companies with hundreds of engineers who had been working on it for years. But the insight there was basically that there's a lot of moments in a company's life where it is actually extremely rational for the buyer to prefer a bundled solution where the second product is 70 or 80% as good as what they could get standalone. And you get all these natural advantages when the products live together, where you can get better pricing, you can have the data talk to one another, you can get these integrations, the workflows make more sense, you don't have to deal with as many vendors. So there are natural advantages, and there are real situations where multiple products can lead to a truly better result for everybody, even if the product is not needing to compete, on its own. compared to the other
Yeah.
product.
I think it's also it's underappreciated sometimes how many of the great companies did actually launch multiple products really early. Like if you look way back in history, Adobe within the first 5 years was in desktop publishing, in Photoshop, and in vector graphics work. Square actually, obviously we think of as having the consumer side and the B2B side, was working on the consumer side within the first 2 years of its life. HubSpot, which I know we've taken a lot of inspiration from for Lattice's journey, started in marketing, was working on sales within the first couple years, certainly less than 50 million of revenue. And so Lattice, we had 3 products before we probably crossed 5 million of revenue and developed that muscle. Maybe just tactically, at that point in time, how much time were you spending with customers? How much did you sort of think of these ideas on your own versus like you were spending and you got them from customers and what they were asking from?
Yeah, I spent like looking back, I realized like what I did, one of the things in the early days that was so helpful was just like an inordinate amount of time with customers. And people have asked me before, like, when you did these second products, did you run like a tight process? What'd that look like? Did you, use a template? What were the user interviews like? And I think really the way that it always worked for me, but for all of us, was if you are just so steeped in customers that you are friends with customers, you're easily texting with customers, they're being honest with you all the time, you know their ins and outs, you know what other products they care about. Even though we had nothing to do with recruiting, you know what recruiting tools they like, you know all of this other stuff. If you know them that intimately, I think then when it comes to those moments, you have this very prepared mind for, oh yeah, well that'll never work because you just intuit it from these customers. And so to me, the way that, at least in the early days, before you're large, I think startup strategy to me always went best when it was a prepared mind that came as a result of tons of time with customers, tons of time thinking deeply about the market, a curiosity about the history of your market, a curiosity about the competitive landscape, not from a place of like, we got to beat all of our competitors, but like, what have some of our competitors done well? What is there to learn? What were their big insights? And I think when you're just in that, then I think hopefully when the strategic moments need doing, a lot of it's present for you.
Yeah. I often call that with teams having Dumbo ears, if you know the kids cartoon character who has massive ears, like being with customers and really listening to them versus preaching to them. And I likewise think that people know that all revenue is not created equal. When you're a bigger company, some revenue has better retention, there's higher gross margin, things like that. But for an early stage company, all revenue is not creating the insights it can give you that inform your product roadmap, that inform your positioning in the market as well. And I know that many of our early customers led to that combo. And obviously Lattice didn't stop there with those 3 product lines. We've now launched an HRIS, which is the core system of record for managing employee data. Maybe walk a little through that big move, which wasn't a 5-engineer endeavor. It was a more bigger endeavor than that, and is the system of record to displacing customers. Maybe walk through sort of the org structure to go about building that, the bigger risk, because it was a much bigger bet than when we were just 20 people.
So from the early days, we had this conversation many times that like Lattice was destined to need to do one of 2 things if it wanted to scale to like 100, 200, 500 million of revenue. It either was going to need to take its product suite from the early days and serve the enterprise, or it was going to need to stick with its mid-market customer segments, customers under a couple thousand employees, and basically build out through the suite of all possible things. And it didn't take a lot of like genius or math to like sort of see that, but it was an important initial realization. And I think that foundational sort of like grips with reality that in order for this company to get to a certain size, it needed to do one of those 2 things. And we, right or wrong, that was like a deep belief of ours. And we then said, okay, those are the 2 long-term strategies. What's going to happen here?
I think there's something in there too, which is in a competitive market, which we're in. You're either moving forward in some direction or you're kind of implicitly moving backwards.
100%.
And so there was always that element of like, we've got to be going in some direction.
Yes, and you always need to, I'm a huge believer that you're best off in general if you are starting with a TAM that is truly like manageable to you where you're at and constantly expanding it. That's much better than just throwing yourself into a truly huge TAM where any possible customer you could sell to when you have 6 people. Much better to serve a niche and then constantly every year being asked, how can you make your TAM bigger through either new geos, new products, new customer sizes, new industries? And I think that was the orientation. So that was a long-winded way of saying the HRIS was always from the get-go in the path where we weren't going to go into the enterprise. It was actually like an inevitability where we were going to build all of these apps, but then one day you need to build the store around it. It would be like, how HubSpot, which you mentioned, you build all these tools around marketing and sales, and then at some point it's like you want to own that core record. And I think that was sort of the, we saw early that it was going to be inevitable. We knew what an endeavor it was to build that product. It's not something that you can build with 5 engineers or 15 engineers. It's a bigger product than that to serve customers of a certain size. And so, I think then it also comes about matching, which new bet you're going to take on when your company has the sort of organizational strength to. And
you hired a former founder.
We did.
To work on that to start.
Yeah, there was a founder who had known who was at his company was Series B at the same time as ours. We went actually through a program in YC, their growth program at the same time. And then he sold his company and wanted like a relative break compared to being a founder and was like, can I, So anyway.
You made it a startup with inside Lattice.
Yes.
One thing that I think is really important in these multi-product acts is there can be an element of like, if only X, then. Like, if only we had X capability, next product line, then we'll finally be able to sell these customers. Then we'll finally be able to, marketing will finally be performant or more performant. Like, and there's sort of a excuses mentality that can emerge. We talked a lot about that along the way, and I think you have sort of some good Lattice values around some of that, keeping accountability for the present, even while working on the next thing.
Yeah, and it's real. This is like one of the biggest struggles is that like you need to simultaneously balance like a future orientation, like all these things we're talking about. You need to be expanding your TAM and thinking about the next product. But when you're small, it's not just like you need to hit the quarter. It's like you got to hit this month. You got to grow this week. And I think those daily, the tension there between the daily realities of like we have to move this ball down the field because like the long term is made up of a lot of short terms and like we have to win each short term along the way too. It's a tricky balance. And I don't know that there's any perfect answer to it other than sort of, it's one of these tough paradoxes that's part of the struggle of building a company.
Clear eyes?
Clear eyes, that's one of it. Clear eyes, full hearts can't lose. But yeah, clear eyes is basically just about like see the world for what it is and so I think like a deep pragmatism is helpful.
One of Lattice's values.
It's one of Lattice's values.
Yeah. Maybe just for the group, it sounds really great to have worked on the next things, the next product lines. Maybe tactically, how did that actually impact kind of the business economics?
Oh, yeah. Well,
just to ground it in, like it wasn't just talk and good to have. It really changed the genes of the business.
It really changes things. I mean, there's two sides. There's pre-launch. There's post-launch. My view on this is before launch, as much as possible, you want to contain the thing. And so the way that we would contain the thing was we would really just try to keep it in that engineering product team that was building it. We would try to cordon those resources off from the rest because otherwise you can get into really weird spots when you've got existing customers trying to pull at those teams who want to work on clear and present problems. And so I always found that the only real way to do it is to separate those resources completely. And then once you launch, it's the opposite. You go to infusing that product to the business as much as possible. So it's like this moment where you go the opposite of it's this quiet secret that we don't care about to all hands on deck, we're all shouting it from the rooftops as a company. And just as an example, like how powerful this can be on the go-to-market side, it's like, as you probably know, one of the cool and challenging things about like SaaS math is that every part of the funnel multiplies by each other. If you add 10% more leads and 15% better conversion to opt and 20% better win rate and 13% better win rate size and 7% better retention, it's like you've doubled your growth rate. And that's like the impact that often happens when you have like a second product that really lands is everything gets better. And so it's extremely alluring when it works.
Yeah, I think we doubled per seat pricing.
Yeah.
in the space of about 3 years.
Yeah.
Building out that suite.
For sure. I mean, yeah, even more probably. You know, like we really were able to drive. That's probably about right. Like, you know, and each of these products would add a couple bucks, but it really stacks and it makes a big impact, and your pricing integrity grows and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe just quickly as we wrap up, you know, it's easy to say, hey, many have to go from their initial wedge to having a broader platform, to having a broader product set. You can look at all the legendary companies, they end up that way. Easy to theorize, hard to do, which we walked through some of those today. But you really did imbue it in the culture of Lattice in many ways. And I'd say a bit of a testament to that is, I think there's at least 3 former Lattice employee-founded companies now, and a number of the team members have gone on to be like employee 1, 2, 3 at other companies. What do you think was sort of you created or looked for in people to create that? We'll keep building, we'll keep creating culture that has persisted even and advanced beyond just Lattice's walls.
Yeah, I think that, like, for better or for worse, a startup ends up in all these ways that are sometimes infuriating, but you'll end up seeing that a startup ends up reflecting a founder's style and preferences to a degree that, like, you wouldn't believe unless you, like, watched it happen yourself. And you'll see something happening in the organization that's like a little frustrating, and you're like, oh wait, that is like a complete personification of what I do wrong. And I think one of the things you can control here is that if you value entrepreneurial people, that will end up in your company. Those will be the types of people you'll be more likely to hire. That's the type of behavior you'll be likely to promote. It's the type of, you know, just people who you will build the company to be welcoming for. And so I actually think the hack here is to just figure out how to truly prefer an entrepreneurial spirit in the team that you build, and it will show up because you'll do a million little things every day to make it happen.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Jack, for sharing that journey. Hopefully, a few helpful nuggets as teams go from that initial wedge and initial customer pull to building about a much broader vision of theirs into enduring success. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.